Buckle up for a new episode of Bumpaholics, the one and only podcast made to teach on all stages of the arrival of a baby, before, during, and after. Whether you're an expecting mother, have questions about fertility, difficulty with lactation, or postpartum, you're sure to learn from our experienced doulas when you listen to Bumpaholics.
Okay, our final topic is secondary trauma for birth workers. I really appreciated that they talked about this topic, where she was saying that basically she kind of felt almost a sort of hatred for her midwife for being there, for what she represented of her loss. But then at the same time, she kind of came to realize that that deep feeling was also that she hated that the midwife was going through her own grieving and loss and sadness. And then it did a whole chapter where it actually was written by, it seemed like it was written from the perspective of the midwife and how she coped and how it changed her practice and who she was as a person, as a birth worker. And this is definitely something that we can speak on. Secondary trauma in birth work is very common, very underspoken about. What do you have to say on secondary trauma for birth workers, Jamie?
Well, I think that a lot of the different things that birth workers do, that like whenever you're fresh out of the gates as a doula, or maybe you've had a baby and you've had certain experiences with birth workers, you don't always realize what kind of baggage they're bringing along with them into that space. Mm-hmm. Some birth workers carry too much of it, like to the point where they haven't been able to let go of some of this baggage, and they carry it with them from one birth to the other, and then it starts to affect these other births. That's part of why it's so important to work through that. If you want to continue doing birth work and doing it well, mm-hmm. To work through your experiences, so you're not carrying that into another person's birth space. It can be important to learn from some of those experiences, but also recognizing that that it's not your birth. So carrying the weight of what happened from other births, like the things that happened because certain decisions were made, doesn't mean you get to look at judge that decision made by another person in their birth, because it's their birth. Mm-hmm. It's a different situation. There's just so much that people carry with them, and sometimes we don't want to recognize that they're carrying their own baggage. Mm-hmm. Don't want to see their perspective whenever it's our birth or our client, and we not that they shouldn't carry that baggage, but just also recognizing that they are human beings.
Yeah. Yes. The baggage is heavy, y'all. It's a lot of work to put it down. Certain experiences can really take you out. And sometimes it's important to be able to rest and take a break, be able to rely on teammates in the situation of Case Women's Ministry. We all work in teams. Decompressing with fellow birth workers is huge. I heavily lean on decompression with my team when I have a really hard birth. And you know, it is secondary trauma. And that's I think the weirdest thing about it. I remember I went to, my pastor's wife does kind of a unofficial therapy with people. If you've gone through something really hard and she sees that you're very upset at altar call, she saw me crying, she'll invite you to tea and do some kind of unofficial therapy with you. And not giving any details of my clients, and very similar, like I tell stories here, I told the story of my client losing her baby, and she just couldn't understand why I was so upset. Or she was like, well, is this someone that you know very well? And I said, well, I mean, they're my clients. So yes, we got close. She said, but don't you have a lot of clients? I said, well, I mean, yeah, I guess relatively. I don't know what you mean by that. And she's like, I just don't understand why you're carrying it so heavily when it wasn't your baby, or like a baby that you were really going to be spending a lot of time with. So, well, I understand that it's secondary trauma. I understand. And that almost makes it weirder to process, is why am I so upset that this happened to someone else, right? But we also carry a lot of responsibility on ourselves, whether we should or not, whether we were supposed to be making those decisions or not, whether we stepped outside of our scope or not. We just feel we were supposed to help. We're supposed to be there for people. And for me, and for the people that I've talked to also help them decompress, the listening, whether I am or the listening ear or I am in need of one, is that is a weird aspect of it. That's kind of the first hurdle to get over, is accepting that it's okay that this is somebody else's trauma that you are now processing, because you experienced it with them. And secondary trauma is real, and it is something that needs to be processed. And I think that birth workers would burn out at a much slower rate if everybody was able to completely decompress and self-care after really traumatic births. You know, thankfully I'm blessed enough to work in an organization where I can, and have, and, you know, we have a training from Mariah Barr, who is a therapist, called Secondary Trauma, Beating Burnout, Secondary Trauma, and Compassion Fatigue. That has a bunch of resources in it that is really, really helpful for us. But I definitely do see birth workers who are not utilizing that and who are carrying this around, and it's exhausting. I can't imagine carrying it around for multiple births. Just the one at a time is enough for me. Fully processing it and putting it down. And we have to, you know, the second birth that I went to after the birth that I attended that had a loss, the first one that I went to there were no scares at any point whatsoever. It was a birth that followed what would be considered a normal track. Very, this is like if the textbook was being held next to her, it would go through the checklist of exactly what normally happens at births, which was very therapeutic for me, and I appreciated it. The second one that I went to after that loss started having signs of fetal distress. And I started feeling very anxious because the baby that lost had no signs of fetal distress. And so I started thinking, oh my gosh, if this person is showing signs of distress, then the baby, like we need to get this baby out. But thankfully I had those tools. That is not my call. I'm not a medical professional. I did not scare my client or anyone else. And the baby was born wonderfully healthy, you know, and had some D cells, and they took care of it like they needed to, as medical professionals. So I definitely felt that baggage in that birth space, but thankfully I had the tools and had done the work and taken some time off. I had taken 3 weeks off and got to a birth in 3 weeks. I was actually starting to get a little like an addict that like needed to go.
You needed your oxytocin fix.
It had been way too long. Yeah, and that's something that's really important to me in my heart. And if you are a birth worker and you need to decompress, you can have my contact information. It's all over our Facebook. Reach out, and I would love to chat with you. I will take time to be your listening ear for you. It's so important, and we put so much time and effort into becoming professionals, and we need doulas. There's way too many people having babies without them. We need them. We need them to be accessible, and we need them to not burn out, especially the good doulas that really care, that are experiencing this trauma because they really care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we don't get into birth work because we don't care. It's
Right.
like you don't just fall into this. It comes from a place of high passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, these birth spaces that you're in, there's hormones flying everywhere, you know, and you can't really go into a birth space without, I mean, it takes quite a bit of baggage to get to go into a birth space and not like feel these like levels of connection because of all these hormones that are going on. It's like it's a unique like place to be, and you have all of this biological stuff that is making it so that you are going to develop connections to this experience. As long as you don't burn out and start completely dissociating.
Get that compassion fatigue, starting to feel like, oh, as soon as they make this decision, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Why should I even care? If you ever start to have those thoughts, it's time to figure out why. We need to do it's more than the basic level of self-care. That's what I like to say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's that basic making sure that your needs are taken care of. That is the absolute minimum. Yes, that's self-care. We start there. If we're showing signs of compassion fatigue, then we need to up it. We need to figure out why. It needs to be talked through with other people who are empathetic but are not experiencing compassion fatigue themselves. Fully decompress, maybe going to see a therapist if that's something that is available to you. And just really getting to fully express your feelings, your frustrations, and then maybe take a break and then come back. Sometimes we do need breaks. Especially if you have some really hard births in a row, I very much encourage you to take, if that's available to you, to take a bit of a break. Maybe do some postpartum work for a while, or something a little less intense. Postpartum work is pretty fun. I mean, it's all fun, but
Cuddle some babies and
some babies, help some mamas breastfeed.
I mean, cleaning can be very therapeutic too. So, you know.
Very much so. Yes. Doing those night shifts, you need to cuddle babies and then clean a house, and it's quiet, especially if you got kids at home. Those night shifts are nice, in my opinion. But and I would also like to recognize that all of the things that we are saying also apply to other types of birth workers, like midwives, nurses, OBs. That's where a lot of their compassion fatigue can come from, where maybe they're seeming particularly harsh. It might be that they were trained to interact with people that way, and it might be that you don't necessarily know what happened at the last birth that they attended, what happened at the last 10 births they've attended if they haven't done the work. Does not excuse the compassion fatigue by any means, but if anyone is watching who is not necessarily doula, but is also involved in birth work in other ways, I encourage you to unload, to kind of find where that compassion fatigue is coming from. And a lot of times just recognizing that that's what medical professionals are going through. As doulas, if we run into, you will run into medical professionals who are experiencing compassion fatigue. Recognizing where that's coming from and then adapting to that can be really helpful for achieving peace in the birth space. That's my doula tip for this recording.
The one?
I know, I didn't do a bunch of them this week. Look at that. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we, of course, will be back next month with the very final week of Ghost Bellies.
The following media content is intended to only be an educational reference guide and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice. While KC Women's Ministry adheres to strict self-set guidelines, any advice, instructions, or information found within this media is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. KCWM makes every effort to broadcast correct information. We simply present the views based on evidence-based information. We welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. We are not sponsored by drug or device companies. By listening or viewing this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast. Under no circumstances shall KC Women's Ministry, any guests or contributors to the podcast, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of KC Women's Ministry be responsible for damages arising from the use of the podcast. Viewer discretion is advised.